So there are two main skills we need to be able to draw heads on our figures beautifully. And the first of those is to capture the basic 3D form of the head. And some clever people have given us some really useful methods for doing that. A famous one is the Loomis head, but you may also have heard of the Asaro head. And then there's the Reilly rhythms. And one question is, which do we use and when do we use them? And I'd also like to introduce you to a version that kind of combines some of the best ideas from each of them for figure drawing, which I call the pointy egg with a notch cut out of it with ears and a face corner. So if you can come up with a catchier name for it than that, let me know in the comments, but it is going to be super useful for your head drawings. So let's get into it. Now, the final and most important part of all of this is going to be right at the end of the video. And now that's a little trick to make sure you watch the whole thing, but it's true. So first of all, the Loomis method, and I think this diagram from the original book is one of the best and clearest explanations of how to do this method. You start with a ball. There are some axis lines that you want to have wrapping around that ball shape. Then you'll flatten the sides, or as he puts it, you chop the sides off. Coming off this axis line, this kind of vertical axis line that is basically running down the middle of the forehead, you keep that going and you run it down to the chin to create a face plane and then build a jaw onto it. So the head ends up being a sphere for this cranium and then a jaw. And then there are some extra ideas for placing the hairline, the brow line, the bottom of the nose and the chin. Now, I've taught this to quite a few people, and I find that a lot of people start to think of this as a formula. It's hard to draw heads, and it's nice to think that there's a formula, and if we just get the formula right, we're going to be able to draw heads. And so people get really obsessed with like how much of the side to chop off, how to place these thirds, and then think that if you get those things right, everything else is going to work out. The way that I would think about the Loomis head is actually as an exercise. And I'd think about the best part of it, the most powerful part of the exercise being right here, drawing a sphere with axis lines running around it. Because when it comes to like how much of the side of the sphere to chop off, you should really base that on looking at the person, because we need to recognize that the flattened side is visible, right? So if you look at your own head, like place your hand on the side of your head, like just above your ear, you'll feel that it's kind of flattened and then it starts to round off. And when you're looking at a reference, you'll be able to see some of the side of the head being flattened, and that's how you flatten the side of the sphere. And the similar thing when it comes to placing the brow and the bottom of the nose and that kind of stuff. Now, the thing that we often don't quite get right when we're drawing heads is the overall volume and which way it's facing, which way it's looking, how much cranium we give the head. And that is taken care of in this method in the sphere with the axis lines. And so we really want to get good with these spheres, pointing them in the same direction as the heads are pointing. And then we can start to go through the rest of the process, add a jaw, chop the side off, and all of that kind of stuff. But the biggest skill, I think, is in orienting those spheres. Let's look at some of the common problems people have when trying to draw these spheres. So one is drawing the axis line really shallow, so it wouldn't really wrap around the sphere, right? So in this case, this axis line is just going to run straight off the sphere if we kept it going. We usually want to draw it as if it would wrap right round the back, all the way around. Make sure that it curves strongly enough to really wrap around the sphere. Now here's the bigger thing. You notice this sphere is turned to the side, so this axis line is now running closer to this side than this side. For whatever reason, our brains want these axis lines to always be more in the middle of our sphere. And so we're either going to accidentally shift it to the middle, or we're going to expand the far side so that it's a bit more in the middle, right? And so when we get more specific about that, let's say we're looking at a head like this, we have this axis line running like that. It's very close to the far side of that sphere, right? There's not much happening up here. This is a narrow shape. Almost every time a student has drawn this, or even sometimes when I draw it, that forehead gets expanded. We don't want to draw that narrow shape on the far side of the axis line. Another example would be, let's say in this head, we've got the sphere. Let's say we have the sphere running something like this. And then let's do the axis line in another color, running down the middle of the face, right? It's very close to the far side of that sphere because we really don't see much of the far side of the face. It's a very narrow shape. Very, very often, without realizing, we're going to expand the far side, add extra to it, because we just don't want to draw it so narrow. But if you can get good with your spheres and turning them, you're going to be off to a really good start. Now, let's talk about some shortcomings to the Loomis method. So one is the head isn't actually ball-shaped. And so what you want to do is start cutting these nice angular ideas of this person's actual head into the sphere. The sphere is the initial ball of clay. You've got to start sculpting the actual person's head into it. Think about the actual shape of their jaw and draw that. Don't go with the formula. Use the formula as your initial volume, but then you want to start sculpting into it. And a second shortcoming to the Loomis method is it really suggests that the face plane is a straight line coming off this axis line. And often I find that that means that people place the chin quite far forward, but most people's faces, or a lot of people's faces, actually curve back inwards a little bit. And you really want to think about that, especially when you're looking up at the head. You see that that curve back really changes if you're looking up at the head, like in here. Let's say the eyes are down here. They're looking up at this curved face. The way that the face is foreshortened really changes when you think of it as curving back. We're going to see a lot more of the mouth and jaw than we do. Look at this. We see none of the forehead here, but we actually see a fair bit of the area under the nose, and that's partly because of that curve back of the face. So you want to think of the Loomis method as an exercise to build some nice skills for throwing down initial volumes, not as a formula for drawing the whole head. Now let's say you really can't get on with the Loomis head, even as a method for initially throwing down, a simple volume. There are other models out there for even that basic volume. I think Steve Houston has an alternative idea for this, and I'll link a video of his that explains that below, if in case you want to find that useful. I personally found the Loomis head nice and straightforward to get started with. Then, if you want to kind of build further onto that, there are some other methods out there like the Asaro head and the Reilly rhythms. What's interesting about those is that they don't really, to my mind, compete with the Loomis head. They kind of sculpt into that initial volume to bring out more planes and ideas about the face. And I don't think they compete with each other either. So the Asaro head is really specifically about planes, whereas Reilly rhythms are about, these rhythms that run through and around the face. But the planes that the Reilly rhythms bring out are similar to the planes that the Asaro head brings out, which makes sense because they're both based on people's faces. It's just that I think the Asaro heads are quite kind of clear-cut and nice for understanding what we're looking at. And then the Reilly rhythms are a nice way to draw because there's a lot more rhythm to them, and you want to kind of get into a rhythm as you put down your lines. So they're just kind of two ways of thinking about the same thing. Having said all of that, I don't think you need the Asaro head ideas, or most of them, or the Reilly rhythm ideas for your heads on figure drawings. So notice that when I introduced this video, I said drawing heads and faces for figure drawings. Figure drawings are not portraits. Very often I'm seeing students draw the figure beautifully, then get to the face and something happens. everything goes out the window in terms of simplifying the forms and the values as we're doing in the rest of the figure. And suddenly the student switches into draw the eyes, draw the nose, draw the mouth. And they all get quite strong outlines. And suddenly all the attention, the visual attention for the drawing is drawn to the eyes, nose, mouth. We don't need to treat the head and face differently to the rest of the figure when we're doing a figure drawing. And very often, a figure drawing is not about the facial features in the same way that a portrait is. It's about the figure and what it's doing and the pose, right? So the squash and stretch in the torso, the broader gesture and movement and things like this. So here are some examples of beautiful figure drawings and figure paintings by Sasha Hartzliev, really beautiful oil paintings. These aren't portraits about the face though, and so you'll see how the face is treated in a more simplified manner so that it's more about the moment and the scene and the light and the big shapes created by the light. Here are some figure drawings and paintings by Steve Houston. These are more about the figure and what the figure is doing. And so you'll see that the face is not treated like, okay, so I've done the figure and now I'm doing the face, so now I got to slap a portrait on top of my figure drawing, right? The face is kind of brought down in its importance and treated in a more simple way. And here are some figure drawings by Lane Brown. Lane does really lovely portraits, but when it comes to the figures, the faces are treated in a more simplified manner. So when it comes to our figure drawings, we might not need all of these interesting planes and ideas that the Asaro head and the Reilly rhythms give us. The more limited 3D idea from the Loomis head may be enough. And I would like to present to you another model that brings out some of the ideas that we might want to take from the Asaro head or whatever, and bring them into our figures depending on what type of figure drawing we're doing. So here I have some simple sort of models for drawing a head. Now in the middle is sort of the Loomis head. Above that is an even more simple version, and below that's a slightly more sophisticated version. And I would think of this as a scale from simple to sort of more sophisticated, more planes cut out of it. And then if you added another level of sophistication, that might be the Asaro head or the Reilly rhythms, and those would be things that would take you to that portrait level. But this is just keeping us on the figure drawing level, and which one of these you use might depend on basically how long the drawing is. If you're doing a 2-minute quick sketch, a 2-minute gesture, you might just go with this. If you're doing something longer, you might just start to bring out more of these ideas. And I think one of the key things here is that for me, learning this was the best way to start. And then it was a bit easier for me to then simplify further or add a bit more sophistication. And that's why I think the Loomis head is such a nice starting point for all of this. And then you can build your own ideas on top of that. But you can see that it's basically, you know, the bull with the jaw on it, or you could just think of it as a sort of pointy egg shape. But then we are adding a brow line and a bit of an indication of the eye socket and the ear. And those are essential because they help us see which way this thing is pointing. So here are some figure drawings where I'm basically just using this idea because they're quicker sketches and they're more simple. And actually sometimes, even in a longer drawing, if it's really not about the head and I'm just trying to throw something basic down for the head, I might still use this. In terms of this version down here, there are a few extra ideas. One is this rhythm that goes from the top of the ear down to the outside of the chin, like outside of the cheekbone. Often a shadow shape kind of runs along this line. And this basically helps us get that transition from the face to the side of the head. And the big notch cut out for the eye sockets, basically. And this notch, I think Steve Houston calls it a whistle notch or something, and I've heard it called a watermelon slice. I think that might be Glenville, but I'm not sure. But this is such a cool idea because it helps to make sure you relate the two sides of the eye sockets together, and it makes sure that you really, instead of painting the eyes on, you know, like imagine you just throw down a Loomis head and you just put eyes onto it, like you're painting them onto the surface. You want to think about how these eye sockets are like integrated into the head and how the planes change. So those are two ideas that are added in here, and it also retains this really nice little plane right here that sort of corresponds to a plane that's created by your cheekbone. And so I really personally find this to be really useful. I think it kind of takes the best things from each method, the most essential things from each method. And so I would personally suggest you practice your axis lines with spheres, and then you can get good at Loomis heads, and then you can start to simplify your Loomis heads more or add a little bit of sophistication on top of your Loomis heads. So earlier I promised that the most important part of all of this would come at the end of the video, and here it is. It's actually not about how you draw the form of the head, it's about where you put that form and what angle you put it at. So what I find happens so much for me is that I end up drawing the head too straight over the rib cage and not shifting it off to the side enough, and therefore making the drawing stiff. Now, I have noticed this happening in 95% of the drawings of my students too. So you may not think you do this, but it may be happening without you realizing. You really, really want to be able to shift this head across, and that is more important than drawing the head well or not, because you're going to lose the gesture if you bring it too straight over the head. One thing that I've noticed is that when I actually start drawings with the head, which is how I've often started my drawings for most of them, I end up then, it kind of locks the figure down somehow in a stiff way, and I start with the head and I end up just bringing everything straight underneath it for some reason. I've found it way better to start at the rib cage and build up my squash and stretch in the torso a little bit, and then make sure, while consciously thinking about making sure that I shift the head off to the side, then I can build my head however I want to construct it.
If you like our tutorials and you're learning to draw figures, you're going to love this PDF guide. It gives you all the skills that you need to work on in order, and then asks you questions to figure out which skill you need to work on next, and then gives you links to the tutorials you need to learn those skills. We've also got a free mini course. It's a 10-day course. It is super powerful and effective. And for your regular figure drawing practice, we have tons of free references you can use in our free reference library. The link to all this stuff is below.
The next tutorial we put out is going to be about the second major skill for drawing heads, because this is the first part, and then the other 50% is coming up in the next one.